Hey there, Mr. Terry, history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. With U.S. warships approaching the coast of Venezuela, I wanted to check out a video dealing with, this potential of, could the U.S. be invading Venezuela? The channel Warfronts is answering that question with this video, so I wanted to see what they have to say, and I'm hoping to find opportunities to drop a little bit of historical context. This original video is down below. Make sure you are supporting them. Also, make sure to sub to my new originals channel, Mr. Terry Originals. We got some fun content, some great hypotheticals with some alternate history, and a whole lot more coming your way. That is also linked down below. All right, let's get started. A good place to start here is going to be with the history of sanctions. If you heard about sanctions, that's where you put in certain blocks to trade, another type of interactions in a country. And this has been going on with the United States and Venezuela for the better part of 20 years. You can go back to the George W. Bush era around 2005, 2006 with the, war on terror and the accusation that Venezuela was potentially not being, cooperative with U.S. anti-terrorism efforts. There's also accusations in 2008 that there were individuals involved in Venezuela that were linked to Hezbollah. And these things also went in through the Obama administration, 2014. There were sanctions against accusations of human rights violations. Towards the end of the Obama administration, there were also sanctions put in response to anti-democratic activities going on in the country. And those also ramped up in the first Trump administration, and it continued into the second Trump administration. And some of those have targeted the oil sector, which is the real lifeblood of Venezuela. And even more recently, tariffs have been put on countries at 25% for those that have been doing oil business with Venezuela. So there's a little bit of background there about what some of the political history has been. And as you've noticed, you have bipartisan sanctions happening with the United States over Venezuela. You had Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, some with executive action, some with the Congress. There's also been a big concern because Venezuela's neighbor that has also had territorial disputes with Guyana. There was a massive finding of a huge oil reserve in Guyana. And that has brought a lot of tension for how Venezuela might pressure the country if, they were to invade. And also how the infrastructure for an oil program in a country that doesn't have that kind of infrastructure or funding to really be able to extract this stuff has also brought in a lot of conversations on that economic perspective. But let's see what Warfronts has got here.
Over the weekend, a large eclectic group of people, including civil servants, housewives, and retirees, lined up all over Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, to join the Bolivarian militia. They were responding to calls from President Nicolas Maduro to volunteer following the deployment of U.S. warships off the Venezuelan coast. The mass turnout was meant to send a message to Washington that the Venezuelan people would not be cowed by America's might. It's a message echoed by Oscar Macias, a 66-year-old auditor who recently signed up. Speaking with the AFP, he said, "I'm here to serve our country. We don't know what might happen, but we must prepare and keep resisting." Although most experts believe that the US will not invade Venezuela, tensions are still at an all-time high, primarily because of fears that the US will instead launch a small tactical strike similar to what we saw in Iran earlier this year. If that happens, it risks dragging the entire region into a conflict and, depending on the target, might even have an impact on the Russia-Ukraine war.
That's where I'm wondering what the conversation would be about targeted strikes. For Iran, it was very clear. It was the threat of their nuclear program developing potentially a nuclear weapon. So the sites that were hit by American bombers were those sites. But in Venezuela, what would that be? Would it be of personnel, of government personnel, oil installations? Or again, how much of this is political posturing?
So how do we get here? What's happening now? And more importantly, where does the region go next? How did we get here? Before we dive in, a quick bit of housekeeping.
Context I put
All
in.
the information in this video is up to date at the time of recording. That's noon. Wow, bang on. Central European time. Due to the fact that our crystal ball is currently malfunctioning, anything after that obviously won't be covered. So if you're sitting there in shock on Wednesday morning as crack Venezuelan troops storm Washington, D.C., just know that we apologize for our lack of psychic powers and promise a follow-up video as soon as possible.
By the way, that's when I'm watching. So if there have been major involvements, they're covering it, I'll try to get something as well.
A disclaimer out of the way, let's tackle the first of our major questions. Just how the heck did we get here?
Yep,
to
context
answer,
is
we
everything,
need to take
right?
a brief detour to 2017 during the first Trump administration. The Venezuelan crisis had been raging.
Now, again, I was at the beginning there talking about stuff going back 20 years, right? So much longer than anything that's happening in 2017. I mean, we're going to have more direct influence, obviously, now, but this has gone through, multiple presidents also in Venezuela. Maduro, Chavez, probably goes without saying, but remember Venezuela developing a socialist state as they, especially nationalize their oil industry, which is their greatest export, which historically, makes you on the opposite side of the political spectrum and inevitably not going to be seen in friendly terms with the United States. You go back to the Cold War for that, right?
Take a brief detour to 2017 during the first Trump administration. The Venezuelan crisis had been raging for 7 years, and several of Trump's advisors raised the possibility of a military intervention. While there were significant members of the administration who opposed this plan, on the 11th of August of that year, the president told reporters he wouldn't rule out the military option. To say that Venezuela was...
By the way, that's something Trump will say a lot. He's never someone that says he's going to rule out anything. That's kind of his thing. He likes to, have that kind of card in his pocket. Is that beneficial? Is that not beneficial? I guess that's up to perspective, but nevertheless, very common tactic.
So that year, the president told reporters he wouldn't rule out the military option. To say that Venezuela was in uproar is a little like saying that post-Endgame Marvel movies have been somewhat bad.
What the hell was I thinking?
Vladimir Lopez, Venezuela's Minister for Defense, criticized Trump for his statement, calling it an act of madness and supreme extremism. The rest of Trump's first term unfolded in a similar manner. Trump or one of his officials made an inflammatory remark and the Venezuelan government hit the roof. An important fact from this period is that Marco Rubio, at the time a senator, suggested a military invasion of Venezuela in at least 2 meetings with senior Trump officials.
This is something, again, that will be highly debated as, one of the major platforms that President Trump has tried to run on is staying out of foreign conflicts. Okay, you're going to have some instances, again, like the, bombing in Iran, other type of strikes on, targets, but like massive, invasions being a big thing that you're even seeing right now amongst the Republican Party being very divided against about U.S. supporting foreign nations, even if it's just supporting certain foreign nations as they are in struggles. But you would think that this most assuredly would be a very divisive issue of actually putting any kind of significant boots on the ground in a foreign country, especially as the Republican Party has really moved to, or much of it, you call that, I don't know if you would call it like the MAGA movement, but this big push of not getting involved in foreign intervention, which I think is maybe the biggest thing the Republican Party has shifted towards from kind of the neoconservative era of the early 2000s.
The suggestion was shot down, but we brought it up to demonstrate Rubio's thinking toward Venezuela. Rubio has made a name for himself as a strident opponent of Maduro, going so far as to recognize Edmundo Maduro's opponent in Venezuela's 2024 election.
And also, in a sense, with Rubio, big-time anti-socialist, anti-communist, which really is, that's a uniparty, that's a bipartisan issue, bipartisan element in American politics.
As president-elect. And that's a pretty opponent in Venezuela's 2024 election as president-elect.
So there was accusations that last election that in Venezuela that Maduro ends up, winning, but was very suspect by people of actually winning. I'd read a thing that local precincts, were claiming that Gonzalez might have won up to about maybe 2/3 of the vote. So was there, election interference or whatever. And that also, I believe, Maduro administration put out kind of like a warrant for him for like terrorist activity or whatever. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong on these things, by the way, feel free to correct. And if there's ever stuff I bring up, I'm telling you what my understanding is, and inevitably I'm going to be wrong on some things, but I think he has fled the country to, I want to say Spain, basically as exile, because with the election, he was basically now wanted. So he bails.
And that's a pretty fair point,
which,
given that all signs point towards
makes sense.
Having
You're going to
won,
want to do that.
But it was still inflammatory, wasn't it? Trump's appointment of Rubio as Secretary of State then was a strong indicator of what his posture toward Maduro would be during a second term. On the 13th of January 2025, 7 days before Trump's swearing in, Maduro suggested that Venezuela, aided by Brazil, should invade Puerto Rico and free its people. In response, Puerto Rican Governor Jennifer González-Colón wrote to Trump claiming that Maduro was an open threat to the national security of the United States.
So this would probably be in the framework of Venezuela, or Maduro would say is like the liberation of these, I guess, Latin American countries from American imperialism. Interesting, what vibes that kind of brought was, how Japan in World War II with the Greater Asia co-prosperity sphere was advocating that they were, liberating Asia from the Western imperialism. with China, down to the Philippines, with the Indies, or the Indonesia. I mean, Malaysia, Singapore, all that stuff. And I know people have a very cynical, understandably very cynical view of that stated goal. So if we were going to, I guess, compare it to Japan, would that then mean Venezuela like takes it over and then is going to rule it as part of a potential Venezuelan socialist empire? A lot of that seems also oxymoronic.
Trump claiming that Maduro was an open threat to the national security of the United States. Soon after, reports emerged that Trump's team wanted Maduro gone, and I quote here, "the way of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad." Although we don't quite have it in writing, it's not much of a stretch to say they wanted Maduro replaced.
No, I mean, look at the whole Cold War history of any type of socialist leader in Latin America and how involved the United States and the CIA was in so many of them. Some successful attempts, some unsuccessful, say like with Fidel Castro in Cuba, with those unsuccessful attempts to sort of remove him from power. So there's plenty of context that this could be something the United States not only would, wish to happen, but could help facilitate, especially if a big, seemingly resistance movement against the Maduro administration was to build. That kind of indirect involvement the United States has done repeatedly in the past is, arm the opposition.
And really, who can blame them? The Maduro regime is one which has plunged its people into biting poverty, threatened neighboring Guyana with invasion, rigged elections, and spread instability in countries like Colombia, where it is the main backer of Marxist guerrilla group ELN. Yet these geopolitical shenanigans aren't what the Trump administration focused on. Instead, they honed in on the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, trying to have them...
This is the big... gang that you heard about over the last months and years about that this gang has made its way, to the United States. Wasn't it said, was it in what was the city kind of around Denver or whatever in Colorado, like the apartment complex, they said was like had all of these members. And I don't know if that ever like came to fruition or whatever, but Trump definitely has talked about how he believes Venezuela, is like sending these gang members, emptying their prisons, and then they're getting literally, driven out of Venezuela and, intentionally, taken to the United States. And we know that had a very resounding effect for supporters with the larger idea of the, undocumented immigrants and just the wave of migration that's become such a big part of the kind of platform for the Trump administration, especially here in the second term, right?
Declared a state-sponsored Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, was trying to have them declared a state-sponsored international terrorist organization. Right. According to immigration policy analyst Alexandra Villarreal, this was meant to justify extreme enforcement measures against Venezuelan immigrants, many of whom were in the United States to flee the Venezuelan crisis. Right. Although the courts shot this down, the Trump administration did declare another Venezuelan gang, Cartel of the Suns, as a specially designated global terrorist group. The administration further alleged that Nicolas Maduro was the leader of that gang. This move coincided with two other important decisions. First, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi doubled the bounty on information that led to the arrest of Maduro from $25 million, the same amount as Osama bin Laden, to $50 million. Second, Trump...
Now, the interesting thing, okay, so it's like a warrant for the arrest. Who would be doing this? Is it just kind of like an open bounty, I guess, if somebody within Venezuela could actually, arrest him? And then what would they do? Extradite him to the United States or to some kind of international court? What would be the end goal here?
Secretly signed a directive to the Pentagon to start using military force against drug cartels this administration had designated as terror groups. It is this directive that the military cited when deploying warships to Venezuela. The deployment currently includes 3 guided missile destroyers, an amphibious squadron, at least 4,500 sailors, and some 22,000 Marines. Officially, the Navy is there to combat drug trafficking. However, given past statements from the Trump administration, some regional observers fear that this is a veiled attempt at either regime change or an invasion.
So could this be a thing where what are you going to do? Do a blockade? It's like a reverse blockade. Like rather than Venezuela getting stuff in, they're going to seize ships going out and search them for drugs. We know the majority of drugs trafficking into the United States actually go through ports of entry. So is this a way to head off the drugs at the pass, I guess?
Certainly, that's the focus the media has run with in endless, breathless pieces. But how likely, really, is either scenario here? Will the US invade Venezuela? Now, at the start of this video,
I guess it depends on what we
that
consider
most
an
experts
invasion.
do not expect the US to invade Venezuela, and that's partly because of something Trump said. Speaking to Fox News in 2020, the president said, "If I wanted to go into Venezuela, I wouldn't make a secret about it. I wouldn't send a small little group. No. It would be called an army."
So not covert operations, which again has been a go-to in so many scenarios with the U.S. intervening in other, countries. But again, it would be like, what is the goal? Is it to force a regime change? The hopes that some of these sanctions have, and I guess a lot of sanctions, which again, you can argue to their effectiveness of sanctions, having an economic effect or economically strangling a country like Venezuela, again, whose economy is as an oil exporter, that would then influence, say, Maduro for whatever, to change policies, be more transparent, I guess, with the democratic processes in the country, crack down on the, gang activity, drug trafficking in general. What we have seen in history is, those type of leaders will use sanctions basically to encourage their people to consider the sanctioning country as an enemy. So almost in a way having an opposite effect. If the hopes of sanctions also is to bring an uprising and, a regime change, a pro-regime change movement inside of these countries, there's not a lot of success that has happened with that. I mean, I guess you could look at Iran, which has had sanctions for, on and off for a long time, for decades, but that hasn't brought any regime change. And again, it's been used sort of as a way to argue that it just confirms that these other countries are your enemy. That, the United States is an enemy. And same thing going on with Venezuela. Almost like it consolidates and grows the power of the person that you want, removed. What do you guys think about, and maybe what are some other contexts we can look at about the successes or failures of sanctions in world history? Let me know down below.
I wouldn't send a small little group. No. It would be called an army. While the force currently deployed to Venezuela would be terrifying to be on the receiving end of, it falls short of what the US would consider an army. To fully appreciate what the US considers an army, we need to go back to the Iraq War, where at its peak, more than 170,000 troops were deployed. The US believes in the doctrine of overwhelming force, and to do that, it needs numbers. According to the Substack Latin America Risk Report, should the US ever decide to invade Venezuela, there will most likely be an aircraft carrier, plenty of support, and tens of thousands of personnel to actually do the fighting.
It's interesting. What came to my mind is going back to like the Teddy Roosevelt era of kind of this peak, I guess, of American imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, of the famous Teddy Roosevelt saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. The big stick was the Navy. That was supposed to be the Navy for the United States. And it's going to be an intimidating thing. I think that's still the goal.
The US would also pull in regional allies to provide locations for troops, equipment, and logistical support. Talking about the size of the deployment only answers the question of whether the US can invade Venezuela. It doesn't address whether the US should do it.
Venezuela?
And, should's a complicated question in geopolitics because a nation's needs are constantly evolving. For Washington, the calculus isn't just about toppling Maduro, it's about whether doing so advances American interests, and at the moment, the answer is no. First, while the US could easily topple the Maduro regime, a government so unpopular it would make even Keir Starmer look like the reincarnation of Winston Churchill, the stabilization process would risk dragging Washington into a forever war. After decades and billions spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions, isn't it? Americans are war-weary, and as William Waldorf wrote in Time, pursuing unpopular wars can create a lot of public resistance to wars that are in the national interest.
That's where, again, you're seeing so much rhetoric around this changing within the Republican Party. As again, in the early 2000s, still the neoconservative era, this idea of a foreign policy based off of, they call that preemptive warfare, has been so heavily criticized in this sort of next generation, the kind of the Gen X takeover of the Republican Party, that is happening now. I predict it would be very unpopular. And I don't even think it's a hot take.
I mean, just look at how many Republicans turned on the idea of supporting Ukraine, despite not a single American soldier being on the ground. Trump.
Hey, and even how much has now turned for just, indirectly aiding Israel and their conflict in Gaza and Palestine as a whole. Even bombing those targets in Iran came under some scrutiny from You know, a lot of it's talking heads, conservative talking heads that aren't necessarily, congressmen and stuff, but there are those out there. Again, it's just something kind of new, I feel like, since 2016 and this kind of new Trump MAGA era of the Republican Party.
In part, rode to victory in 2016 by being the only GOP candidate to call the Iraq War a disaster. Would he really risk the peacemaker reputation he desires for another
that was a bipartisan
Iraq-style quagmire? Second, the US wouldn't have the legal authorization or the regional support to carry out this war. Now, you could say the same for Iraq, but again, that was a painful experience that Washington does not want to repeat. And this time, the US would be unlikely to have even a single regional ally on side. For all Caracas's meddling in Colombia, not even Bogota is going to stand behind a US invasion force. Third, and perhaps most importantly, an invasion risks worsening the already dire humanitarian conditions in the country. For years, Venezuela has exported eye-watering number of migrants the US is now targeting for heavy-handed deportations. Would Trump really be willing to risk millions more fleeing to America at a time when immigration is such a hot topic?
And so many of those migrants, again, are anti-Maduro people, that don't support the, current regime. They want something different. They believe in sort of the American system of politics and economics, anti-socialist, anti-communist coming into the country. And yeah, it's just, going to be continued deportation of those people back to a country they left because they didn't like how things function there. And of course, what supersedes all of that stuff is just the economy in general. I interact with a lot of students that are, Venezuelan migrants that, come through my school and stuff. And they usually cite, the economic conditions for what's, led them to come to the United States.
After all that, you might be asking, but Simon, a full-scale invasion isn't the only option. What about a small tactical strike like you mentioned earlier? Well, that is also complicated. For the US to conduct a precision strike, it would need to preemptively take out Venezuela's air defense system. These systems, including the Ante-2500, were primarily acquired from Russia and have Russian operators helping with maintenance and security. Taking them out risks antagonizing Russia at a time when Trump seems to be making yet more overtures to Moscow about peace in Ukraine.
I wonder if, though, the United States really takes into big account some of these, like the technologies of other countries when it comes to with defense, offense, whatever it is, just because the United States is so overpowering when it comes to military technology. It's I don't know. I mean, can you really overstate the technological mismatch when it comes to the U.S. artillery?
Even if Washington somehow manages to thread that needle, there's the issue of target selection. There are 3 possible targets for such a strike. One would be President Maduro himself, given the rhetoric coming out of Washington. However, that carries with it the inherent risk of making Maduro a martyr for people to rally around.
And that happens. That does happen. There are times it becomes just evidence of who the enemy actually is. You know what I mean?
And should the Americans fail, it will allow Maduro to portray himself as the victim. Second, there's the Russian-built ammunition plant. While this is the clearest military target on the list, hitting it carries an even greater risk than hitting the air defense systems, given the money that Russia has spent building it.
The attempts of either assassinations or, again, regime change, like with Fidel Castro in Cuba, was also used to strengthen his support. It did have that. It also created tighter connections with the Soviet Union. So could that be something that some of these other countries, if it is Russia or whatever, grow tighter in an alliance with Venezuela if there are attempts to remove him from power, whether by whatever means the U.S. could choose to do so. So there is precedent to think about here.
Finally, the US can choose to strike directly at the drug cartels within Venezuela, which carries with it not only the risk of civilian casualties, but unleashing a tidal wave of anti-Americanism across Latin America, where leaders are already worried about the US taking unilateral action on their soil.
There's been discussions of that, by the way, with the US in Mexico, of strikes, small forces or whatever, going in and taking out, I guess, operating areas of that as well. So that's another thing that's similar.
But now let's consider a third alternative, one where the US neither invades Venezuela nor launches a targeted strike. In such a scenario,
sanctions?
Why would Washington need a strong presence in the region? One possible reason is as a bargaining chip with the Venezuelan government to get it to step up in the fight against drug trafficking. In the days since US ships arrived in Venezuela,
we still need to talk about Guyana.
Caracas has sent 1,500 troops to its border with Colombia. According to Diosdado Cabela, these troops are meant to ensure peace and combat criminal groups in the region.
Diosdado Cabello.
Here we do fight drug trafficking, here we do fight drug cartels on all fronts. The minister also announced the seizure of 53 tons of drugs so far this year. This is a move aimed at showing the Trump administration that Venezuela is willing to play ball, and for Trump, such a move may be enough to mollify him. And finally, there's another underappreciated reason why the US may have sent such a powerful force to the Venezuelan waters: to deter any possible aggression from Venezuela towards Guyana. As you may
I'm glad he said this. I think this is such an important part to talk about right now. Like I was saying, it was recently discovered in Guyana, which is a neighbor they've already had territorial disputes on, that has been announced to have a massive untapped oil reserve. And naturally, Venezuela is going to be interested in that, whether it's an invasion or not. And then also for American economic interests, investors and contractors, there is the opportunity for insane amount of economic investment in building up Guyana's infrastructure that way, because Guyana does not have the capital to be able to conduct the process of getting this oil, out of the ground and the refining and all that stuff, and almost assuredly will need foreign investment. And that could go a lot of different ways. They may open it up to foreign countries who's got the best, to offer, who's going to want, the least from the Guyanese government, who's going to, allow them to keep the most when it comes to profits and things. Is that going to be United States contractors? Go to China. A lot of countries are going now to China for their infrastructure investment. A lot are doing that. You see that all around Africa and in other parts of South America as well. And again, Venezuela would have plenty of interest in that too. So I'm glad that he mentioned that, because I do think that's a major part of why the US is going to show extra interest here.
Call from our recent Situation Room episode, there are signs that Caracas has not surrendered its dream of annexing Guyana's oil-rich Essequibo region, using gang infiltration and grey zone tactics to keep Georgetown on edge. This naval deployment may simply be Trump's not too subtle way of saying, "Don't you f***ing dare." What happens next? So that leaves us with one final question. What happens next? Well, at this point, nobody knows. We are just as likely to wake up tomorrow and find that all the American ships have suddenly sailed back to port as we are to see reports of fresh deployments. The reality is, the future hinges on two moving parts: what Maduro does next, and how far Trump is willing to push this standoff.
That's fair.
Maduro has positioned himself as
although, do we need to add third party? Is anyone else going to be stepping up in this? Russia going to say to back down? China going to say anything? What's the rest of South America going to be saying? Maybe those are more to a minor extent to consider.
Defender of Venezuela's sovereignty, while signaling to Trump that he may be willing to come to the table and negotiate and give Trump what he wants. And while Maduro is about as trustworthy as a talking snake offering you a bite of a delicious apple, being able to say that the Venezuelan autocrat caved to his demands on drug gangs might be the sort of thing that Trump would love to crow about. Trump, on the other hand, needs to navigate being tough on Maduro.
Wait, was that a real hat? I never saw that hat. I don't know, in the AI era. There's also a World Cup trophy. Was that what this was about? I mean, the U.S. is going to be hosting the World Cup next year. The hat that said Trump was right about everything.
If he can strike this balance, he gets to go into midterms with a significant foreign policy win under his belt. This means that U.S. presence in Venezuelan waters could be as much about optics as it is about geopolitical strategy. Meanwhile,
that is geopolitical strategy, though.
Plays out. Both Russia and China have invested heavily in Venezuela, and any U.S. military intervention runs turning the country into another proxy war. This is the worst-case scenario. But, I mean, the 2020s have done a pretty good job so far of making sure that worst-case scenarios come to pass, haven't they? So where's that leave us? Well, balancing on a knife's edge, waiting to see what happens next. These next few weeks will be decisive, telling us whether this story will one day be a mere footnote in the history of this decade, or the prologue for a far more interesting, far more terrifying chapter.
By the way, this video suggestion came up. Unified Syria will never work. I'd actually be really interested in checking this out. Let me know if that's something I should, put in the queue here. All right, I do have some final thoughts, though. In thinking the big picture, and I guess down the road here, I was wondering, and I am wondering, what is the conclusion of anything of just the Venezuela United States saga as a whole? Is this going to be one of those things that's going to mimic Iran, where it's just going to be decades and decades and decades of this without any direct military intervention? It's just going to be these, strikes that happen potentially, which the U.S. hasn't done a lot of in Iran. but like, you know, sanctions, but then also just the status quo in, you know, like Venezuela just stays the same, as like the Iranian government is going to just, you know, weaponize, I guess, for their own political gain, these sanctions and the rhetoric that happens in these countries, or in both of those countries. But the Venezuela story doesn't go quite as deep as the Iranian story, which again goes, you know, way further back than the Iranian Revolution, of course. But is there another outcome you think that is likely to happen with Venezuela? Maybe something more positive in its interactions as compared to the United States and Iran? I don't know. What do you think is more likely? All right. Thanks for hanging out, guys. Again, before you forget, please sub to my new channel, Mr. Terry Originals. I'm going to do some giveaways here pretty soon to hopefully thank some of these early subs as we're trying to grow the channel. Putting out content on it every day is kind of a grand opening. Love to see you over there. We'll see y'all next time.